Daniel had always dreamed of owning a home where peace wasn't just a word, but a feeling. After years of working long shifts, saving every extra dollar, and putting aside personal comforts, he finally signed the deed to a modest but beautiful house on Maplewood Drive. The neighborhood seemed like something out of a picture book, lined with tall oak trees, kids laughing as they rode bicycles down the sidewalks, and neighbors who waved politely as he moved in. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt like he had found a place where he truly belonged. In the first few weeks, he settled into his new life. He mowed his lawn every Saturday morning, planted roses along the walkway, and painted his front door a deep navy blue. To him, it wasn't just a color. It was a memory of evenings by the ocean, a reminder of calm. Every time he looked at it, he smiled. He thought it was the perfect finishing touch to his dream home. But one quiet afternoon, Daniel returned from work to find a plain white envelope tucked under his doormat. At first, he assumed it was a friendly welcome letter from the neighborhood. Smiling, he tore it open. His smile vanished almost instantly. Inside was a violation notice from the Homeowners Association. Your front door color does not comply with community standards. Please repaint in an approved neutral tone within 30 days to avoid fines. Daniel frowned. A rule about door colors? That seemed strange, but not wanting to start off on the wrong foot, he decided to comply. That weekend, he went to the hardware store, bought a can of beige paint, and carefully covered the door. He sighed, telling himself, "It's just paint. No big deal." He believed that would be the end of it. But only weeks later, another letter arrived. This time, the HOA accused him of failing to properly conceal his trash cans. Daniel scratched his head. He had placed them neatly on the side of his house, just like his neighbors. Why was this suddenly an issue? He tried to shrug it off again, but the letters kept coming. One claimed his mailbox wasn't the right size, though it matched two others on the same street. Another declared that his flower garden, the roses he had planted, with so much pride, was too unconventional for community standards. His once joyful hobby was now being treated like an offense. At first, Daniel laughed it off with his co-workers. The HOA must have too much free time, he joked. But the laughter faded as the notices piled up. Each envelope that appeared on his doorstep carried the same heavy weight. He began to feel targeted, as though someone on the board had decided they didn't want him there. The truth became harder to ignore when one evening, while unloading groceries from his car, Daniel was approached by a man in a perfectly pressed suit. His name was Mr. Clark, a member of the HOA board. His expression was stern, his voice sharp. "Mr. Daniels," he said, not even getting the name quite right, "you've received multiple violation notices. Some residents feel your home is out of place. Perhaps this isn't the right neighborhood for you." Daniel froze, a grocery bag hanging loosely in his hand. "I've fixed everything you asked me to fix," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I repainted the door. I followed the rules. What more do you want from me?" Mr. Clark gave a dismissive shrug. "The HOA has standards. Some people fit in here, some don't. If the violations continue, we'll have no choice but to take further action, perhaps even removal." And with that, Clark walked away, leaving Daniel standing alone in his driveway. That night, Daniel sat at his kitchen table long after the groceries were put away. He spread the stack of violation letters in front of him, reading each one over again. His frustration boiled into something more: hurt, disbelief, and eventually, resolve. "This is my home," he whispered, staring at the papers. "They don't get to decide whether I belong here." Weeks passed, and more warnings came. The final one was impossible to ignore. It arrived in a bold red envelope, stating that if Daniel didn't pay the mounting fines and fully comply with every regulation, the HOA would begin legal action to force him out of the community. He leaned back in his chair, the letter trembling in his hand. For a moment, he felt cornered, almost defeated. But then, something shifted inside him. Instead of fear, he felt a spark of determination. Daniel looked around at the home he had worked so hard to earn: the neatly painted beige door, the tidy lawn, the roses swaying gently in the evening breeze. He clenched his fist and whispered to himself, "If they think they can push me out, they're about to learn just how wrong they are." In that moment, an idea began forming in his mind. He didn't yet know how, but one thing was certain. The HOA had just started a battle they couldn't win. After that night, Daniel stopped looking at the HOA as a group of neighbors managing the community. In his eyes, they had become something else entirely, a wall standing between him and the life he had worked so hard for. He knew arguing with them would be pointless. Every letter, every warning, every stiff conversation proved they weren't interested in compromise. They wanted control. And if he wanted to survive here, he had to think differently. The first step came almost by accident. Daniel started attending HOA meetings. He walked into the small community center where they were held, sat quietly at the back and listened. At first, no one paid much attention to him, but the more meetings he attended, the more he learned. He discovered how the HOA collected funds, how votes worked, and how much power was tied to property ownership. He learned that for every house owned in the neighborhood, there was a vote. And those votes decided everything: rules, fines, even who sat on the board. That piece of information stayed with him long after the meeting ended. Back home, he began researching the HOA itself. Late nights turned into early mornings as he pored over county records, financial statements, and community bylaws. He realized the board wasn't as strong as it pretended to be. Many homeowners were frustrated but felt powerless. Several families were behind on their dues. Some even wanted to sell and move away. Daniel saw an opportunity. The first house went up for sale just 3 streets over. A family, tired of the HOA's constant nitpicking, decided to move. Daniel didn't hesitate. Using his savings and a small loan, he purchased the property under a company name. It wasn't easy, but he felt a thrill when the papers were signed. That house didn't just mean real estate. It meant one vote in the HOA's decision-making. Weeks later, another property came on the market. He bought that too. Then another. Each purchase drained his resources, but every time he signed a contract, he felt the balance of power shift slightly. The same people who wanted him out had no idea he was slowly building a quiet influence they couldn't touch. Of course, it wasn't just about buying homes. Daniel also began walking the neighborhood, talking to the families who lived there. He listened as they vented about ridiculous rules: Christmas lights that had to be taken down within 3 days, basketball hoops forbidden in driveways, even small welcome mats considered non-compliant. Many residents felt trapped but didn't know what to do. Daniel nodded, sympathized, and promised them he was working on something. He didn't reveal everything, not yet, but he let them know they weren't alone. Slowly, neighbors began to see him not as the man constantly fined by the HOA, but as someone willing to push back. Meanwhile, the letters kept arriving at his own home. One accused him of allowing his grass to grow half an inch too tall. Another threatened him with daily fines if he didn't remove a small bird feeder hanging from his porch. Each notice was more absurd than the last. He stopped arguing with them. Instead, he filed the letters neatly into a folder. He knew one day they would be part of the story he told. The final straw came in the form of a red envelope. Inside, the HOA demanded thousands in unpaid fines and declared that if he failed to comply, they would begin the process of removing him legally. Daniel read the letter slowly, then placed it on the table with the rest. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel the weight of it, the fear, the frustration, the anger, and then, almost unexpectedly, he smiled. Because what the HOA didn't know was that Daniel had already purchased nearly half a dozen properties in the neighborhood. Some directly, some through his company, and some with the help of investors who believed in him. He was no longer just a homeowner being bullied. He was quickly becoming one of the most powerful stakeholders on the block. Still, it wasn't easy. Every purchase meant sacrifice. He lived frugally, worked overtime, and borrowed when he had to. There were nights he lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if he was making a terrible mistake. But every time doubt crept in, he thought of Mr. Clark's words, "Maybe this isn't the right neighborhood for you." Those words burned in his memory, fueling him like nothing else could. By the end of the year, Daniel's quiet plan had grown into something undeniable. He wasn't just a homeowner anymore. He was a force within the neighborhood, someone with both the will and the means to change everything. The HOA still saw him as a nuisance, a man they were close to driving out. They had no idea that the very ground they stood on was already beginning to shift. The annual HOA meeting was always a formal affair. Folding chairs lined the community center, residents gathered reluctantly, and the board members sat proudly at the front table. Most meetings ended with stricter rules, more fines, and a few weary sighs from homeowners who knew they had no choice but to comply. But this year was different. Daniel walked into the room carrying a thick folder under his arm. His steps were steady, his face calm. The same people who had once seen him as an outsider now whispered as he passed by. Some smiled, some nodded in quiet support, while others looked at him with a mix of confusion and curiosity. He took a seat near the front, directly across from the board. Mr. Clark, the same man who had told him he didn't belong, opened the meeting with his usual stiff tone. "We'll begin with roll call," he announced. As the list of properties was read aloud, Daniel raised his hand again and again. 1 property, 2 properties, 3 properties. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the realization spread. He wasn't just a single homeowner anymore. He was representing nearly half the block. Clark's voice faltered. "There must be some mistake," he muttered, scanning the papers in front of him. But it wasn't a mistake. It was the result of months of sacrifice, planning, and determination. When the time came for votes, Daniel spoke up for the first time. His voice wasn't angry or bitter. It was calm, measured, and steady. "As a majority homeowner in this neighborhood, I'd like to propose changes to our rules." A murmur spread through the crowd. Residents leaned forward, their eyes wide. For years, they had watched the HOA impose fines for the smallest details, mailbox sizes, flower colors, even holiday decorations. Now, for the first time, someone was standing up to challenge the system. Daniel laid out his vision. No more absurd restrictions about door colors or flower beds. No more punishments for families who wanted to celebrate holidays or let their children play outside. Instead, the HOA would focus on safety, property value, and fostering a sense of community. His proposals were simple, fair, and filled with the kind of common sense the board had long ignored. At first, the board tried to resist. Clark's face grew red as he argued. "These rules are in place for a reason. Without them, this neighborhood will fall into chaos." But the room no longer belonged to him. One by one, residents stood up and voiced their support for Daniel. A mother spoke about being fined for letting her kids leave chalk drawings on the driveway. An elderly couple described how they were threatened over their Christmas lights. Laughter, frustration, and even applause filled the hall as neighbors shared stories that had been bottled up for years. By the time the final vote was called, the outcome was undeniable. Daniel had the majority, and with it, the power to reshape the HOA entirely. The rules that once suffocated the neighborhood were overturned. In their place, a new spirit of fairness was written into the bylaws. For the first time in years, the residents applauded during a meeting, not out of obligation, but out of genuine relief. The applause grew louder, echoing through the small hall until it felt like the very walls were shaking. Clark sat back in his chair, stunned into silence. The man he had once dismissed as someone who didn't fit in had just taken control of everything. The very system that had been used to push Daniel out was now in his hands. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood transformed. Children played freely without fear of rules about basketball hoops or bicycles. Families decorated their homes with pride, unafraid of being fined for a splash of color or holiday cheer. Neighbors gathered for barbecues and evening walks, smiling at one another without the shadow of constant surveillance hanging over them. Daniel often walked down the street quietly, watching the changes unfold. People waved with genuine gratitude. Some came up to thank him personally, shaking his hand, calling him the man who had saved the block. For Daniel, it wasn't about recognition. It was about finally feeling at home in the place he had worked so hard to build. One evening, he stood on his porch, the sun setting in warm hues over the street he now partially owned. The roses swayed gently in the breeze, untouched by petty rules. He thought back to the very first violation letter, the one about his navy blue door. What had started as an attempt to push him out had become the spark that gave him strength. He whispered to himself, almost smiling, "They tried to kick me out, and now this entire block is finally free." It wasn't revenge, not in the bitter sense. It was justice. A reminder that sometimes when people try to take away your place, the best response isn't to run, it's to stand firm, take control, and make it truly yours. And so, the neighborhood on Maplewood Drive found peace again. Not the peace of silence and conformity, but the peace of community, freedom, and belonging. The peace Daniel had dreamed of all along.